Okay, good morning, everyone. I am super excited to have our guest. Hopefully, he'll be joining us here shortly to talk about Cayman genealogy. So, we have Mr. Olivaire Watler and Miss Cathy Frazer. I think that they are getting ready. I just see a few quick messages here from Miss Cathy. She has sent some photos which we're going to share as part of this morning's presentation. So until she gets here, let us just have a quick check-in with everyone to see how you guys are doing. Who's here with me this morning? Give me a big shout out. Let me know what is going on. And of course, I need to turn on my trusty light. I've got my eye this morning. I tell you what, some mornings my eyes are just so irritated. And it always seems to be this left eye. I think the left eye is just my weaker eye. Now that we're coming out of COVID-19 and we can start to make some appointments, I think I've definitely got to go see maybe an allergist or something. But this left eye is just very, very irritated this morning. So I've already put in my eye drops. Good morning, Gina. Good morning, Evelyn. I see Miss Cathy has joined me. Miss Cathy, give me 1 second here. I do want to just pull up some of your photos. And we're also waiting on Olivaire to jump into the conversation. Miss Cathy, you just sent me some beautiful photos here that I just want to make available so we can talk about some of these and who some persons are. So give me 1 second to do that. There's just something amazing about old time photos. I don't know if it's just me, but I love a black and white, or I don't know what we would call like the early days of color. I don't know what we call that type of color, but it's just absolutely amazing how these photos look and how they've even been preserved. Have you guys ever wondered, with photography now being like everything is so digital, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when our grandchildren and our great grandchildren are looking at our photos, how are they going to tell that they were old photos? Because everything is so digital. Like, will the digital technology change to the point where it's going to be obvious? Like, obviously, if you see a picture from 60 years ago, a regular photo, you know that that's a photo from 60 years ago. I've always kind of thought about it in the digital world. Like, how will we know that those are actually old photos? The things that make you go, Hi, Miss Cathy.
Morning.
How are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Buenos dias to Elizabeth. She has just joined us as well. We're going to let Oliver jump in when he can. But Cathy, let's start talking a little bit about yourself. Maybe some of our viewers do not know who you are, so why not do just a basic introduction and then we can jump into why you're here today.
Okay, well, my name is Cathy Frazer. My parents were Dalkeith Bodden and Vita Marin Bodden, and I go back, my family goes back to the very first settlers in Cayman, the Boddens and the Watlers, and the Hills and the Edens, McCoys, you name it, I am rooted in Cayman. I am a property manager and I am married to Jerry Frazer. We have 2 children, Jewel and Katie. Everybody seems to know Jewel. Katie is a vet and she lives in the US right now. She's coming home in a few years, hopefully. We have 2 beautiful grandchildren. And the reason I got into genealogy was because I didn't want to marry a relative.
Okay.
And everybody in Grand Cayman is a relative.
Oh my gosh. You know what is so funny about that, Kathy? I remember because I hadn't lived in Cayman. When I came back, I mean, I was already married actually, but I always used to say that to my dad, like, I can't take the chance of marrying a Caymanian because I kind of felt like it would just be my luck that
Yeah.
I would get married and years later somebody would be like, oh, by the way, that person is your cousin. And nobody bothered to tell you. And so I think genealogy is a fascinating topic. One of the things that we'll get to a little bit later on this morning is sometimes, this segment that we're doing this week is who you're for, but sometimes who you think you're for, you're not really for.
That's very true.
So we're going to talk about some of those things.
DNA
It
is
goes, it
that.
goes way back as well. It's not something that young people just started doing because I always think it's interesting when the older heads say, well, these young people, they're not easy, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, that sort of thing has been happening for a very long time. So we will get there. So basically, you became interested in genealogy because you wanted to know who your relatives were, how you were connected to people.
Exactly.
Okay, how long ago did you start this journey?
Oh my goodness. I actually started doing some research when I was in my early 20s,
Hmm.
but we didn't have the I didn't know where to turn, so I went to the library and I checked out different whatever I could find on the history of Cayman, and I looked at all the names and I would write the names down. I'd go back home and ask my parents, how is this one related? Well, they're a Bodden, they're a Merritt, they're a McCoy, they're a Eden. How are they related? And they would tell me.
Hmm.
But I don't know if my parents ever knew that how they were related or that they were related. Because even when I joined the Cayman Connections genealogy group, I kept asking, how are my parents related? Are my parents related? And nobody seemed to be able to tell me. But yet the names kept coming up, especially Eden and Bodden. And I said, I'm going to figure this out if it kills me.
Right.
I found out that they were fourth cousins.
Wow.
Yeah, my
Not
mom's
not that far removed.
yeah, my mom's family came through the first wife, and my dad's family came through the second wife of William Eden, the guy that built Pedro St. James.
Yes.
So that's how they were related.
Amazing.
That was the closest that I could find that they were related, but I'm sure I know their ties further back too.
Yes. Right. Wow. Hmm. Okay. Well, I guess let's start at the beginning. You said that you started having a look at what available resources there were. Now, what resources did you find when you started your journey? Like, if someone wants to start, where's the first logical place that they should begin?
Well, today I
Hmm.
would recommend contacting Cayman Connections.
Right.
That
And
is
that's Facebook.
it's a genealogist site. And
Okay.
yeah, we communicate via email,
Okay.
and there are a lot of family trees, a lot of information on there. Rona Panton and Joellen Thompson are some of the moderators. I believe Olivaire might be a moderator too. I'm not sure.
Hmm.
But when you email Cayman Connections, you will find you'll get a lot of information once you get accepted to the site. You have to explain who you are as far as you know, and then they will do some research and they will introduce you to the rest of the group.
Okay. All right. So you start there. When you first got started, obviously you said that group wasn't around. So
No,
you use the old-fashioned methods of the National Archives.
no, I didn't ask the archive.
Okay.
I went to the library and I checked out a couple of old books because
Oh,
I saw the names of people in those books, and I wanted to find out from my parents, who are these people and how were they related, or are they related? And
right.
that's how I found out.
Okay, so when you started your journey, Cathy, your parents were still very much alive.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Okay, all right.
yeah.
I do have some. I think you may have sent me some of these more than once. I'm just gonna pull up some of
Oh, I'm
these.
sorry.
That's okay. So you've got the relationship between Mary Ann Eden and Catherine Arlen Bodden. That's on your paternal side. Maybe they have slightly different names. So I'm gonna just check.
Well, actually,
Um,
that's yeah,
Dorothy Bodden. So I'm just trying to see. Hold on one second here. Oh, these are actually different people that you sent. I see.
right.
Okay, give me one
Just
second
to show
here.
you how they all tie in.
Right. All right. So in the meantime, then Cathy, tell us when you first went to the library, what did you find? Because I would not have even thought of going to a traditional library. What is there at the library that is so incredibly interesting?
I found George Hurst's book, History of the Cayman Islands. That was my first resource.
Mm-hmm.
And then that I found pictures too of my family, my mother's family, and some of my dad's family.
At
My,
the library.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah. History of
Okay.
the Cayman Islands. It was in the library back then. I'm not sure if it is now. It should be, but I'm not sure if it is now or not.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to the library in quite a while.
Okay. And these were all in an actual book that you found these
Yes,
photos.
yes.
Okay. All right. So tell us what was that like flipping through a book and seeing, oh, well, this is my family right here.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that must have been quite surprising.
I also bought later on when it was published. I also bought the newest History of the Cayman Islands book, and that has a lot of photos in it. And yeah, it's rather interesting to look through it and find all these people that, yeah, oh my gosh, they're my cousins. Oh, that's my mother. That's my father. That's my aunt, my uncle. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So you need to have a bit of a starting point, I would assume, at least knowing who your grandparents are. Like if
Oh,
someone doesn't know beyond their grandparents, does it become more difficult to kind of start the process? Because some people will know. I mean, I know some people came out that can tell you, oh, my great grandparents are. For
yeah.
me, I have no clue. I'm just like, I don't know.
Well, guess what, Sandy? Guess what? If you join Cayman Connections, you will find out because someone, I don't remember how it came up, but your family came up as,
Oh, really?
yeah. And yeah, I said, oh my gosh, I got to find this. I got to send this to you. So
Wow. Okay.
I'll go back. That was just, I think it was last week.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So I
So
think I better check that out. I was told recently, recently being, within the last year, by a family member that we're actually related to the McCoys, which I had never heard before.
you probably
I
are.
don't know
You're
what the connection is.
from.
Yes.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's a situation where, you had women back in those days who may have married multiple times. And sometimes when they married, they had an existing child. The child took the name of whoever they got married to, but
That's,
biologically, that actually wasn't their child.
that's,
So, I've always assumed that we had a very strong connection to the Solomons, but I think that that connection was a stepfather's name just taken on, is what I'm now sort of hearing. So I think I need to dig a little bit deeper, but we're not going to go into my family history quite yet. Cathy, we have a photo here of your great grandparents. Now tell us a little bit about who these individuals are.
that is my great grandfather, William Stephen Watler, and his
Okay.
wife, Elizabeth Evangeline Thompson. He was the guy that blazed the Mastic Trail, he and his brother.
Oh, wow.
He
That's
had
interesting.
several siblings, but it was he and his brother. I think his name was Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
But he's the East End Watler.
Okay.
His brother was, and
Mhm.
the one that the progenitor of the East End Watlers.
Right. Now,
So
once Olivaire joins us, we're going to talk a little bit about the Watlers.
yes, he has a lot of information.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these early families, we saw this last week when we were talking about, just race relations and slavery in the history of the Cayman Islands. Alric Lindsay actually sent us a very interesting document that had a lot of the names of the early families.
Mm-hmm.
And although that document, it appears, had some typos in it, we saw names that were very, very familiar. I'm going to just see if I can pull up a few pieces of that document to again share with people in case they missed it last week. So
Mm-hmm.
here, for example, are an account of some of the people in Bodden Town. So we had, for example, we see some of the Boddens. We see, it says William, Joseph and William Connor, but we think that was actually Connor.
Well,
So
it
we think that that is probably a typo of some
into
sort.
Conyor.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even this one here that says Susan Farturn may have been Farnum. So we think that there's a couple typos as we worked through this yesterday or last week, sorry, and persons were making some comments on this. Um, there likely are a few typos in these documents, but again, some of the names are very obvious. We see a James Wood, we see a John Watler, we see a couple McCoys in here, obviously the Boddens.
Yeah.
Here's another one that was like West Bay, Southwest Sound, which I'm assuming is part of South Sound.
Yes.
And then Boatswain's Bay. It's kind of interesting how they separated back in that day, even the different sections of West Bay. So we have like a Walker, a Rivers, Hides, but spelled a little bit differently than how we're used to spelling it now. Some Ebankses, Bishops, quite a few Watlers, and what they're calling is Southwest Sound. So we see a James Watler, Susanna Watler, and then we see one or two Bushes in there as well. So this listed the people of color, and I want to talk about how people of color, because we understand that a lot of times colored persons back in the day, who were basically slaves, acquired the names of their, I guess, for lack of a better word, their slave owners or slave masters. And so I think that that's an interesting part of history that maybe we can, figure out how that all works in terms of names. But here's a Charles McLean. This name here, Charles Pouchet, I think is probably what we now have as maybe Poochie.
I think so, yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I see that Olivaire has joined us. So Olivaire, we're going to bring you into the conversation here in just a second. We do have some additional family photos for Miss Cathy. So Cathy, tell us in this photograph, what are we looking at here? Who are these persons here that we're having a look at?
Okay, the couple that are seated are my grandparents. That's Captain Benny Bodden and his wife, Eva. Now, it was her parents that we saw the picture of earlier, the Watlers. That's how I'm connected to the Watlers.
Oh, okay.
And the little boy next to his dad is my dad, Dalkeith. And then behind him is Uncle Harry, and then Uncle Will. Everybody knows him as Will T. And then Uncle Benson and Aunt Eva Lee. And that was actually taken in front of their house on Pool Road.
Okay. So your Uncle Will T, would that be the man that Will T Drive is named after?
Yes, that's correct.
Wow. Okay. And what was it that he did in his lifetime?
He was pretty much a farmer, but he was also a preacher.
Okay.
And he also had the first printing press in the Cayman Islands.
Wow. Interesting. All right. So we have a Mr. Edgar Samuel McCoy.
Yep. That's my great-grandfather on my mother's side.
On your mother's side. So on your mother's side, you have a connection, a very close connection to then the Watlers and the McCoys.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was my mom's grandfather. That was her mother's father.
Her mother's father. Okay. And what sort of he looks like he might have been a proper businessman.
He
What
was. I heard he died in 1920, I believe it was, and they said he was very proper. He was. That whole family were very proper, and they were strict.
mm-hmm.
My mother said that she was only 5 when he died, but she remembered whenever he came to visit them, he always came on a donkey, and he was dressed in a full suit with a hat. And when he got to the gate, everybody had to line up outside and go and meet him and say, "Good morning, Grandfather McCoy."
Wow.
He demanded respect.
Yes.
Funny thing about him is he left Cayman. I don't remember the year, but it was in the mid to late 1800s. And he went to work in Nicaragua. He worked for an American gold mine owner.
Mm-hmm.
And that owner, from what we understand, left when he died. He left the mine, the gold mine, to Edgar McCoy. So Edgar McCoy then had a lot of Caymanian relatives that he took over to Nicaragua. And that's basically how a lot of them made their money, was through mining this gold and selling it.
Okay.
He was married 3 times. His first wife was my great grandmother. She was an Ali from Georgetown. And McCoy's villa on South Church Street, he built that. That's where my grandmother was born.
Mm-hmm.
When he went to Nicaragua, he married another lady. And I don't know what happened with that marriage, but that they didn't have any children. And then he married another one, and her name was Luciana. And they had 4 children.
In Nicaragua.
Right. They had 4 children. And to this day, I am trying so hard to try to find the descendants of those children, and I can't find them. So far, I don't know.
Wow. So, how did this work back then? Explain this to me just a little bit here. You said that he was marrying. Was he marrying and divorcing, or did you just?
Yeah, yeah, he married and divorced.
So let's just be clear here. Okay, so that's good. So that was a little bit different to be marrying and divorcing a couple times even back then.
I know.
So you know for sure that he had 4 children in Nicaragua. Any idea what part of Nicaragua? Or
I understand they were born in Bluefields, but they moved to Corn Island.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. One more photo.
His mother was a Wood. His mother was Catherine Wood, and I guess that's my name, where my name originated. But the name Catherine.
Right.
But she was from Peace Bay, and her and all of the Woods from Peace Bay, we descend from that family.
Okay. Now tell us, this is a little bit more of a modern picture, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that was 1972.
This was 1972. Wow.
I believe so, yeah. That's
who were we looking at in this photo?
Okay, in the blue coat is Uncle Harry, and then Uncle Will, and Eva Lee, my dad, and Uncle Benson.
Okay. Benson, what's the last name?
Bodden. They were all Boddens.
Okay. These are all Boddens in this picture.
Yes.
Okay.
And they were all born on Mary Street. Back then it was called Maryland.
Wow. And Mary Street, we now think is predominantly, because I've got relatives in the Mary Street area. And of course, I think, the McFields have Barnes, some of the, what would have been really the African persons have dominated that residential area for a really long time. Do you know anything about how the, for lack of a better word, how the races sort of mixed in the early days? So,
I hear people talking about racial issues here,
Yeah.
I never, in my family, we never had any discussion about race, any kind of derogatory discussion about race. That was not, it was, I never knew about it. The first time in my life that I knew anything about black and white and the racial discrimination was when I went to school in 1974 in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
And I hated it. I was so shocked. I hated it. And that's why, thank God, we had ICCI by that time. I came home and finished at ICCI.
Interesting.
Yeah, I can't understand why people are racist. I really can't. I remember when I told my mom about it and everything, she said, well, people don't understand that everybody has red blood. So what difference does the skin color make?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just how I was raised.
Right. Yes. Now it's interesting that she would use the term red blood because, I mean, African blood, most people would refer to it as black blood. So even that statement to me is kind of a very interesting choice of words to describe what she was saying to you.
Black blood?
I mean, I've always thought that Cayman obviously has a separation, but I think we have done it in such a way that it's a bit more, in some instances, and maybe your direct connection and your family was just that different, right? But I think in a lot of ways it was very subtle in perhaps how it was done. But so you're saying that you don't recall, even when you were younger, maybe this is before your days, any separation, like segregation based on color
No,
or any of that? You don't remember when the schools might have been segregated, when
no. I
you don't
don't
remember any of that?
think we were ever segregated here. I don't think so.
Apparently we were.
But it was like one family.
Yeah.
That's how we grew up.
Yeah. I think people may have just experienced different things. So again, it probably just depended on exactly where you were. So let's have Olivaire jump in the conversation. Good morning, Olivaire. Thank you so
Morning.
much. How are you?
I'm good. How are you all?
We're good. We're good.
Good to
Thank
see you.
Hi, Cathy.
Yes.
So Olivaire, I'm gonna just remove Cathy for one quick second from the screen. And I want you to tell us a little bit about your start. So Cathy has shared with us why she was interested in genealogy and how she got started. Really, she said basically she didn't want to end up marrying a family member. So she thought, I'd better know who I'm related to. And she
That's
started
very smart.
yeah, she started her search at the public library.
Yeah.
What was your motivation for getting started with your interest in, figuring out who you follow, where you come from, all of those things?
Well, I guess the impetus was when we were expecting my first son, Aiden. And it was that sense of kind of, generations passing that made me think, well, I need to be able to hand down, a legacy and a heritage to him of who we are and where we came from. And so I began to do some research in earnest at that point. I kind of always knew vaguely about relatives or distant relatives because of my grandmother. She grew up in an era when you referred to everyone as cousin this and cousin that. And so she would have a special day that she would go into Georgetown to, visit cousin Daisy or cousin Royal or, cousin Pearl. And so I was sort of dimly aware at an early age that we had distant relatives, different parts of the island, but I wasn't quite sure how exactly we were related. So it was very intriguing for me later on to make all those connections and to see, this is why she called this one cousin so it's her first cousin or her second cousin. And I was very fortunate in beginning to have, this whole search to have a real resource, a living resource in Aunt Phoebe Watler Spence. She was actually my cousin, but because she was 2 generations removed, we call her Aunt Phoebe. But she had a phenomenal memory. A lot of people I remember her. I mean, she died at age 96, and up to just before she passed, she could recite poems 2 minutes long.
Wow.
And she also had a keen interest in these things. So she was able to give me quite a lot of family history that
Mhm.
took me back 200 years on the Watler family. And, up until this point, I have not found anything which I would say was conclusively wrong about what she said. So she was a terrific resource.
Hmm. You make mention of the fact that people refer to each other as cousins or aunts, and we kind of sometimes use those terms very, very loosely. So,
Mhm.
like, if you even today, I'll have people say to me, "I know we're related, so hey,
Mhm.
cuz," you know what I'm saying? But you're not sure if you're actually a cousin.
Right.
How did you find, as you did your research, that those terms were either firmed up based on, kind of what you were told, or were there times when you were surprised to find out the actual proper relationship of someone that maybe you thought was a cousin or you thought was an aunt?
Well, I found that there was a certain consistency, at
Mm,
least in my family, if it was a close relative.
right.
So if it was a close female relative, but she was older, then it became aunt. We didn't get so technical as to say, this is my first cousin once removed or something like this.
Right.
Um, and so I think it's in more recent times when somebody is maybe a close friend of your parent or something that you call them aunt or uncle. But I didn't find it in growing up that was the case. It may have been exceptionally the case, but not generally in my experience.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So, the reasoning then why you kind of got interested in it was when you started having children of your own, and you wanted to pass on a little bit of history to them. How did the process get started? Like, where did you think, right, this is a logical point for me to begin?
Well, for me, it was interviewing older people. As I mentioned earlier, I started with Aunt Phoebe, and there were a number of older people. So I found that the oldest person, that I knew who was in some way related to me, who still had a good memory.
Mm-hmm.
There were always tidbits of information that you could gain from them. And of course, with oral genealogy, it's good to get from as many sources as possible so that you can compare and you can sort out differences as between them. Because of course, memories fade, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people are even motivated to give themselves a little bit of a different background than they had. So you can sort that out as you compare one oral genealogy with the next, and one oral history with the next. And so for me, that was the big start. Before I ever got into any documentary research, it was really interviewing older people.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So, I suppose at the end of the day, that is, sort of a critical reason why it's good to have older people around,
Oh, yes.
because they can provide some very interesting tidbits of information. What, in terms of relying on the oral history, what did you find to be the most interesting thing? Were these older people telling you the behind the scenes story? I mean, when I think of even the concept of Mall Road, right? I
Yes.
imagine you got a lot of Mall Road stories from these older people in terms of what
Yeah.
was really going on.
Well, yes. I mean, there were some very interesting bits of information that you gain, the backstory to relationships, to place names, even. Because
Mhm.
sometimes you just heard this place name, you have no idea, well, where did you get this name from?
Mhm.
And they would fill you in on that, and it just gave you more of a picture. I always had an excellent relationship with older
Mhm.
people. When my first kind of job that I had as a child was a newspaper delivery boy. And so that gave me an excellent opportunity to interact with older people. And often I was the first and perhaps the only person they had seen for the day. So when I went to deliver the newspaper, I actually spent a little time with them. and chatted, and they were delighted that here was a young person who was interested in what they had to say, and I was delighted to have their company and their wisdom.
Wow. Um, how did you, when you kind of sat down with them, where did you start off the conversation? What was kind of the traditional way that you would break the ice?
That's going back a long way. um, well, I tried to establish, I guess, how exactly we were related.
Right.
So if I knew that this person was on so and so, I wanted to establish what the relationship was exactly.
Hmm.
So one of the things with Aunt Phoebe, for example, one of the things I didn't know at first was that she was a double Watler. Both her mother and her father were Watlers. I was most closely related to her through her mother's side. Her mother and my great grandfather were siblings. But I was also related to her father's side, just one generation removed from that. So basically, back in those days, I know it sounds strange to us now, but back in those days, it was not unusual to find cousins marrying, even first cousins marrying. So this was back in the 1800s, and
Right.
of course, Cayman had a relatively small population,
Mm.
and parts of the population was kind of remote from other parts of the population. And so, in order to find a mate in that relatively small community, it was almost inevitable that it would be somebody related to you in some way, some more distant, some closer.
Right. And I mean, in practical ways, because they didn't always necessarily have transportation, it made sense that it would be in walking distance, perhaps, for households that were
Yeah.
relatively close by as well. For those who may be watching who don't know like what a double cousin is, I think most of us kind of do know, but um, that is something that is not even because I know persons in my generation who would be, well, they're a little bit older perhaps, but they would probably be, in their 50s who have discovered over time that they're actually related to people on both sides and very close relations as well. So what is this concept of we have Gladys who's just messaged us and she said that she's watching from the US. What is this concept, Olivaire, of being double related or double cousin in genealogy? What does that mean?
Well, double and triple and quadruple and all those things we have in Cayman.
Yeah.
Um, and, because again, coming down to the generations, if you have a community like Cayman was, the
Mhm.
island that time forgot, there weren't that many people coming into the islands. And so over time, you would find that, the children of two siblings, if not they got married, then perhaps their grandchildren got married. And then they in turn might marry, um, a descendant of, let's say, a grand uncle or a great grand uncle or something like that. And so you became, doubly related. And that's reflected in the DNA matches that I have.
Mhm.
There are people who, on paper, should be my fifth cousin or sixth cousin, but by DNA, they are my DNA second or third cousin. And that's
Mhm.
because they're related in multiple ways. And so you get some sticky DNA, which then gets, multiplied. And you come up with saying, well, wow, how is this person my second cousin? Well, they're not actually your second cousin, but they might be your fifth cousin 5 times over or something.
Okay, well, we're going to try to get you to explain the whole DNA part to us
Right.
in a little bit. So, what was the most interesting thing initially that you discovered when you first got started? So, unlike Miss Cathy, who kind of went to the library and she relied on the written textbooks that she initially came across, you were more relying on initial oral history, which you would then go back and try to confirm. How were you confirming that information? And what was some of the most surprising things that you found out early on?
Right. Well, I mean, I did spend some time at the National Archive, and have certain records there that are very good sources for genealogy. So it related to marriages, and deaths. Um, there would be records like wills recorded, land transactions, and those help sort of pull the pieces together. And then subsequent to that, I joined Cayman Connections, which is an online genealogy group, and they had been started, I think, a couple of years before I joined. They were a tremendous resource, and still are. So because then you got a bigger pooling of information.
Right.
You've got people from um, all over the world, really, and they have different lines of Caymanian ancestry and their own traditions and stories which are handed down to them. And sometimes you're able to fit in missing pieces, from your tree just by comparing information. I remember I spent quite a lot of time in the early days visiting most of the local cemeteries and taking down information.
Mm.
Um, and so I had contributed those files to, Cayman Connections. These days, that's kind of been superseded by Find a Grave. So Find a Grave now has all the same information together with a photo of the actual grave of the person. And they often also suggest relationships between the people, that whose tombs are in the cemetery.
So there's an actual website called
Yes,
Find Grave.
Find a Grave. Yes.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
interesting. I'd never heard of that before. Okay. So basically, people, I guess, over time have done what you initially did by going to grave sites,
Hmm.
taking photos, and then other persons have put the information together that this person might have been siblings to so and so's child.
Correct.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. The things that you
So
find out.
that's a really great resource to anyone getting started
Mhm.
because it's updated very often. So you will find people who died a couple months ago.
Mhm.
You will find them on Find a Grave quite often.
Wow, amazing.
Um,
Let's bring in.
Obituaries, of course, at funerals are another tremendous resource. I,
Um,
as a church organist, I've been to quite a lot of funerals.
mhm.
Um, if you get, especially if you have it printed in the program or something, is great information to go through and see the connections. You can really fill in a lot of gaps there.
Hmm. Okay, let's bring Cathy back. Hi, Cathy. We haven't forgotten you.
That's all right.
Now, Olivaire was telling us a little bit about some of the resources that he used, which some of them are different than what you were using. So he,
But I use them now too.
yes.
Yeah, we use Find the Grave a lot too.
Okay, good. And then he mentioned Cayman Connections, which you had also
Hmm.
mentioned as being quite a helpful resource. At what time in your respective journeys did you start to think modern technology in terms of DNA evidence was the way to go?
Um, I don't even remember. I think it was actually Olivaire that started in our discussion, started talking about DNA and how important it was to do the DNA. Um, and I'm pretty sure I have to credit him in getting me on that bandwagon. And I am so glad I did. Thank you, cuz.
Yeah.
Olivier, for you then, at what stage in your research did you make the connection that DNA is the way to go here?
Well, there came a point at which, having researched all of my immediate family and Gun Bay and so forth, there was always this question, um, are you related to all of these other Watlers on the island?
Hmm.
And the Watlers in Gun Bay said, yes, we are. And they gave me an oral history. Some people from, other districts said, well, no, we're not. Some weren't sure. So I thought, well, the only way that I can conclusively prove this, I mean, there are things like wills and land transactions, but the only way of conclusively proving this is to do DNA tests.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can show relatedness by that, then that is scientifically proved and beyond dispute. So we thought of it first of all in autosomal DNA, which is to say that the DNA that you inherit 50% approximately from each parent, and that is the DNA that will determine like your ethnic characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
But it also shows relatedness between people. But then there's also Y DNA, which each male carries a Y chromosome that he inherits from his father. That's the difference between male and female. The female has two X chromosomes, male has an X and a Y chromosome. So you can trace a direct male line of ancestry using the Y chromosome, which is tested. And so if you can show a connection, you can show common ancestry using the Y chromosome, then it is also clearly established that you're related and you have a common male ancestor.
Okay. So how do I that's interesting. Do you have to, where do you get started with DNA testing? Do you have to like do two separate tests based on what you just said? Or is there like a central, um, popular DNA data bank that you can go to and say, right, just take this test and give me all the information? How does that process work?
There are a number of DNA testing companies in the US, and
Yeah.
that's what we would use for this purpose. I mean, DNA, I think, is tested here, but that is for medical purposes,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a lot, or to establish paternity, and that is a lot more expensive than the popular DNA test that you might see advertised on TV. So sites like Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, um, and MyHeritage, for example. All of those, by the way, I tested on. But you would submit a sample. Um, Depends on which service it is, what kind of sample they want, how it's taken. So it might be an inside cheek swab, or it might be simply saliva. And so that goes into a vial and it is mailed to them. So they send you a kit first. You pay for it, they send you a kit.
Mm-hmm.
That kit contains the vial. You put your sample in, you mail it back to them, and in a few weeks, you will normally get a result from that. So there are many different kinds of tests that you can take, right? So it's the autosomal, there are different levels of Y-DNA testing, and then the very advanced Y-DNA testing as well. I've done all of them.
Okay. Now, Miss Kathy has just sent us an ancestry DNA story for Kathy. So we're going to just screen grab this real quick and we're going to bring this into the conversation. So, Olivaire, you were mentioning that the Watlers, there's a bit of a debate about what Watlers might have been connected and, I guess maybe how they were connected, right?
Hmm.
I find it interesting because, when we were speaking to Cathy earlier, she said that when she grew up, she was never really aware of any um, racism or any sort of separation based on the races. Now, obviously, you both, we're going to talk about your connections here in a second. You and Cathy are actually both related. You look a lot different than Cathy.
Fair enough.
We're going to talk about that here in a second. But what have been your experiences? I mean, we know Cayman had racism, so this isn't really a question that I'm asking you. But even in terms of what you looked at with the oral history, talking to some of the older heads, I'm trying to figure out these connections. I have to wonder, especially with the Watlers, because we know that we have people in Cayman who will say, they're white Caymanians, right? I wonder if the distinction with the Watlers and why some people say, no, we're not related to the Watlers from Gun Bay or East End or whatever. Is it because you guys were considered the people of color Watlers versus other Watlers who will see themselves as white Caymanians?
Well, I think we need to recognize that the separation in the different branches on that family tree occurred pretty early on, right?
Mm.
So we're looking at 2 centuries ago. And so people didn't necessarily know all of that history,
Mm.
um, because the Watlers in Gun Bay would have come from Bodden Town.
Mm.
Um, and whereas, coming from there, you might retain some knowledge of that connection. Because your branch went away, those who remain might not necessarily retain that information. And I think they were simply looking at it to say, well, they don't look like me. Um, so no, I don't think they're related to me. They're from, they're from Gun Bay. They don't look like me. That equates they're not related to me.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Susan says, good morning, everyone. The DNA testing is amazing, but you have to have a basic family tree for it to assist you. Otherwise, it just brings more questions than answers. Is that the experience that you guys found when you started looking at the DNA angle? Although by that point, you may have already had a basic family tree.
We certainly have, yes, a family tree in place. This was more kind of trying to confirm relationships.
Yeah.
And it's still, of course, still useful when they're very close relatives, because, well, there's been some surprises with those. So somebody whom you might not have known was closely related to you is proved by DNA to be closely related. And then you establish, oh, that was an outside child of so and so. That's how they're closely related to me. And so then you're able to add to your family tree in that way. You might not have known that information otherwise. It might have been a family secret. It might have been,
Mhm.
somebody simply went abroad and had a child and came back to Cayman. They may not even have known about the child.
Interesting. So DNA services may have a way of exposing family secrets.
Oh, it's a revealer of secrets.
Yes. Huh. Did you find any Olivaire family secrets that you're willing to share with us? Your experiences?
Well, there was a quite recent one. I had an older cousin. Now he was, when he died, he was age 98, going on 99. And I tried to spend some, time with him and talk with him about the past and so forth. But he always assured us that, he had been married, but he never had any children with his wife and so forth. He did acknowledge that there was an outside son here in Cayman, but we never knew. We just took, well, that's his account, right? So then one day somebody showed up as a close cousin on Ancestry DNA to me. And so I had to investigate this. And so typically I will send him a short message saying, I see that Ancestry predicts that we are whatever, second cousins, third cousins. Would you like to exchange family tree information to see how we're related? That's my kind of standard initial message. And so they came back and said, well, yes, my grandmother says, or my mother, I think in that case, says that her father was a Mr. X, surname Watler, from Cayman. Well, not, sorry, let me correct that, who was Panamanian. Now, this immediately made a kind of connection for me, because the same gentleman in question that I mentioned earlier, who was age 98 when he passed, he had lived in Panama for a while, and then he had moved to New York City. Well, this person's mother had been born in New York City. And then she said, yes, and he was a very light-skinned man, but when I was born, her mother was dark-skinned. When I was born, he disowned me because I looked too dark, so that couldn't be his child. And so, because of that, he didn't regard himself as having any children um, in New York. But there she was. Now, because I had been avidly pursuing this with him, I'd actually got his DNA tested before he passed.
Mhm.
It was on a different site on Family Tree DNA. So I asked her to get her mom to go and test her DNA on Family Tree DNA. And I was in control of this kid. I was the administrator of his DNA um, profile. So before long, sure enough, she pops up, father, daughter, father, daughter. So we knew that her story was correct. This was indeed her father. And that I found a whole new branch of family in New York. Um, cousins and who I should say also were delighted to find a relationship because they had grown up not knowing half of their family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They knew their mother's side. They only had a name and a place which was not even Cayman, connected to who, their father, grandfather was. And all of a sudden, it just opened up. A number of them are my friends on Facebook.
That's an amazing story. And one of the things as I was listening to you that occurred to me is that was
Mm,
probably a lot more common than people realize because we had such a seafaring history where our men traveled all over the world. So,
mhm,
despite the fact that they may have had, a girlfriend or fiance or even a wife in the Cayman Islands, when they were traveling, they were probably looking for the comforts of a woman. And it's entirely understandable why there may be children that don't know of their exact Cayman lineage in neighboring countries, Honduras, Cuba, Jamaica, anywhere in the world, really, because their seamen were
mhm.
all over Europe. There were some in Texas. I mean, they traveled near and far.
That's interesting what you say, and it's very true because a friend of mine who has now passed on told me that her father told her on his deathbed that
Mm,
he had two children. He was a seaman,
mhm.
and he had two children in Asia. Didn't
Wow.
say where, just said in Asia.
Mm.
Oh my God.
And he'd been supporting them for many, many years. So I don't know if she ever found out because she died, as well, not too long after that happened. But she said she was going to look through his papers and see if he could find it. She could find any letters
Hmm.
to lead her to who these two half siblings were.
Amazing. Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
just connecting with something Cathy mentioned earlier, she talked about her grandfather, uh,
Hmm.
Samuel McCoy,
Great grandfather.
great grandfather, and how they were had these gold mines in Nicaragua and so forth.
Hmm.
Well, it turns out that my great grandfather and two of his brothers actually worked in gold mines in Nicaragua, and
Mhm.
it appears by some DNA matches that I have that there's some descendants from them coming from Nicaragua.
Watlers or McCoys?
Watlers.
Because
So
now who knows, they might be integrated with the Watlers there too. So I'm still looking. I'm constantly looking for these four people.
yeah, because this would have been in the first I guess the first quarter of the 1900s, before 1925 thereabouts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, so Kathy, I just want to pull up. Give me 1 second here. I do want to pull up your ancestral DNA, and then I want to talk about this for a minute so that you can tell us what you found most interesting when you got these test results. Just give me 1 second here.
Mhm.
Let me just see where I've just saved this. Um, hmm.
I see Catherine Smalden says that she has a DNA match with me. That's right.
Oh, really? Oh my gosh. Okay, hold on one second here. Was there anyone, Olivaire, that you were really surprised to find out that you might have been related to?
Well, yes, quite a number. Um, because, touching on the issue of race, whilst we knew from family tree that, okay, the Watlers are related, I
Hmm.
didn't reckon on being related to other white families in other parts of the island, in Georgetown and West Bay and so forth. And so those really surprised me. And in some cases, I just cannot show how exactly is it the DNA comes up and shows that you're definitely related. And just a word there about the DNA. Some people have asked me, oh, well, could it not just be a false match, a fluke? Why they're showing up as related? Now, it is possible for very small matches of DNA to be just a fluke. You call it identical by chance, as opposed to identical by descent. When I say very small, we're talking about segments of DNA which are, let's say, less than 8 centimorgans, and that's a kind of unit of measurement that you use. Um, those are not the sort of matches I'm talking about. In fact, I never get that far down in my list of matches because there are hundreds and hundreds before you get there, and it's unless you have an existing family tree showing the relationship, there's virtually no point in trying to connect with somebody who is that distantly related. You will never find that. It's a needle in a haystack. Um, but some of those cases, I mean, I found that the Georgetown Thompsons are, DNA relatives and not distant at all. I'm talking in some cases 100 centimorgans, which is quite a lot when you're talking about somebody that you can't even show how exactly they're related to you on your family tree.
Hmm.
So it's impossible for that kind of matching segment to
Yeah,
be by accident.
right.
Mhm.
It's interesting that you talked about the one connection that you now have that you discovered through your New York relatives. And that kind of made me remember a situation with a friend that I have who years ago, her mom passed away, and there was always this question of her paternal connections. In other words, who was her father? She grew up in a single parent household with just her mother, and of course, the older people had stories. So after her mother passed away, because it was never a conversation that the mother was willing to have with her, unfortunately. And so after the mother passed away, older people in her search kind of came forward and say, oh, I know who you're for, because of course everybody knows who you're for, but you sometimes, you know what I mean? So people made a lot of assumptions about who this individual is for. And one of those assumptions that she, I think, probably wanted to really embrace and believe was someone who was overseas in a completely different country. And she went to great lengths to track that person down. It became one of those situations where 40, 50 years later, you're getting in contact with someone to say, I'm potentially your child. And I think the interesting thing that happened in that case is they started to have discussions before a DNA test was done to confirm whether or not that was actually the case.
Hmm.
And quite interestingly enough, that meant that he had to then confess to his wife of 49.9 years that at some point when I was in the Cayman Islands, you might have been, I don't know if they were married at the time or it was just his fiance or whatever, but he had some kind of liaison and he may have a child out of this. And then you've got siblings who are like, we could have a sibling who is in the Cayman Islands. Like it was really a shocking sort of situation.
Hmm.
Turns out that after he had to make this confession to his wife and the siblings were like, okay, they'd open up their mind to the possibility of having a sibling. it turns out that that actually wasn't her father. So I always think of that, when I think of sometimes we're searching and we're looking for connections and we're looking for people. There are times when we might actually really want a connection to exist and it simply doesn't exist, but it opens up new possibilities. And it, in this case, it opened up probably old wounds for this couple to have a discussion about how this might even be a question. Have you found that some people, Olivaire or Cathy, may have been really surprised? Like they always thought, okay, this person is definitely my father. And through, whether it's your Cayman connections or DNA tests, that then they discover the shock of their lives that who you thought you were for isn't actually who you're for.
I know a number of stories like that. I mean, there was a cousin of mine, and they grew up thinking that X was their father, and that's what I was always told. And but there was a separate story I wasn't aware of that, in fact, Y was the father, and more recently, DNA tests have proved that Y is indeed their father.
Wow.
So that comes as fully grown adult in their 50s or whatever.
Yeah. And it must be quite a shock to have accepted someone as your father your entire life, and then realizing that, wow, I've missed out on a relationship maybe with someone who, actually is my real father. Like, how do you process? I don't know that you necessarily know this, but how do you, advise people to even process something like that?
Yes. And how does it alter the relationship that you may have had with the person that you thought was your father?
Exactly.
Because it may have been, okay, the person that your mother's married to, and you might have grown up with them, and your relationship with them as father. There's a change. That father's, maybe he didn't know, maybe it changes his relationship with you. All of a sudden he finds that, oh, this is not really my child.
Yeah.
Now, many men will say, well, it makes no difference. I mean,
Yes.
that's the relationship between us.
Yeah.
For some people, it will make a difference. And it's a lot of processing, I imagine, to be done. Fortunately, in my own case, I didn't really come across any big surprises in that way. Everything pretty much checked out on my line. This is who I was told. That's pretty much what the line is.
There was going back to that story, it kind of ended in a very interesting way. The person never through DNA discovered who they were for, but they definitely eliminated this overseas potential father. And then, an older Caymanian before he passed away said, I don't need, typical Caymanian fashion, really. I don't need a DNA test. I know that you're definitely for me. So I don't believe that they were ever able to secure a DNA test before that person passed away. So there is a little bit of a question mark there if that was actually the father. But at some point you kind of feel like, am I in the middle of an episode on Jerry Springer here, where it's like, okay, you are not the father, and then we move on to contestant number 2.
Yeah.
Yes, you are the father. You've got to be, but this is why I think what Oliver mentioned earlier is so important in terms of having the oral history, which sometimes can be spot on. It obviously depends on where in the mall road it is and how accurate the person is that's giving it to you. So here we have someone who had a bit of oral information that they believed and they thought was accurate that turned out to be completely false, and that actually wasn't the father.
Right.
And relationships are tricky like that because people don't always disclose, obviously, who their partners are. There could be secret relationships for a number of different reasons.
If I might just touch on something, in my research, what I found was a certain trend, at least among some of my sources. There is a tendency amongst Caymanians to Europeanize their ancestry more than what it is. So that people, even say white Caymanians, would sometimes bring their European ancestors much closer than they are. They might say, well, my grandfather was from England. but actually it was your great-great-great-grandfather who was from England. And then also with some Black families, you will find that they will sometimes adopt an identity. And I'm going to give one example because I think it needs to be said. One of my ancestors, he's actually my third great-grandfather twice, was James Welcome. James Welcome had been a slave, and he shows up in the slave records. And James was quite clearly a very clever man. He found a way to make a lot of money whilst being a slave, which is I know just remarkable. So much so that he was able to purchase his own freedom.
Wow.
And so before the abolition of slavery came about in 1834, this was in the late 1820s, he purchased his freedom. And to give you a picture there of what that meant, I think at the time that cost about 70 pounds. And a plot of land on which you could build a house or farm, whatever, you could have got for a fraction of that. So James then went on, and he had two daughters, both of whom I'm descended from, both of whom married white men. And what it turns out is that the white men, who of course are also my great-great-grandfathers, they were relatively poor whites, but their Black wives were actually quite wealthy because they inherited wealth from their father. What's another story that's remarkable about James is that he gave a plot of land to a white widow whose husband had died and left her with a lot of children. And my guess is that she didn't have much means of support at that time. Now, I want you to reflect on this. This has been around 1840. So slavery had only been abolished a few years, right? 6 years or so. And here is this former slave giving a former slave owner's, widow plot of land, apparently to help her sustain herself. I mean, that is an absolutely remarkable story. I don't know why anyone would want to disclaim James's African heritage to make him European when he has such a remarkable story in his own right of who he really is.
Exactly.
Yeah. But maybe, I mean, I don't know. Well, I think that the truth is, Olivaire, that there's a lot of us who are not comfortable with our own slave history or our own blackness, for lack of a better word. Because I even know of people in East End, for example, who you look at them, they might be a little bit fair skinned, but obviously, they're Black Caribbean, Afro Caribbean people. And you hear them talk about, oh, my Scottish connections in the family or my European connections. And we're like, why are we having this conversation? I mean, I look at you and I figure you might be able to find 5% of some European or 10% of some European connection, but clearly the vast majority of, of you have to be, from that slave history. And why deny that?
I will say, though, that it might surprise you how much European ancestry that practically any Caymanian has. I think that you will find that in most cases it's going to be quite a lot more than 5 to 10%. And partly that is because even the slaves that we had were not necessarily 100% African.
Right.
This was a revelation to me. You've got, the British had different classifications. So they had musties and quadroons and, mulattoes and so forth. And so you can have an appreciation of what degree of racial mix these persons had as slaves. And that was different from a lot of other places where slaves were largely African stock. So you will find that the average Caymanian, I would guess, probably has at least 25% European heritage.
Okay, interesting. Let's pull up, Cathy, your, I finally found that DNA profile here. Let's have a look at this. This is your DNA story. Um, was any of this surprising to you when you got the results back?
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
No, because of the research that I had already done, and the people that I'd spoken to. Yes, I know that my European heritage comes way, way back. We're talking like between 7 and 11 generations. But we're just, and like I said before, I'm a mutt, and I think majority of Caymanians, we are so mixed with as much as we can imagine or more, that there's no other word for it than that we're mutts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that Caymanians are, I would say, all mixed to a greater or lesser degree.
Mm-hmm.
So you will get some who are mostly African ancestry,
Right.
some who are mostly European ancestry, but you will tend to find that there's some kind of mix, even if it's a trace amount, even if it's 2-3% that's there. You will find, and you will find that there's more of that mix with the ones who appear more African, so that you would get somebody who is, as I say, I don't think that the average amount of European ancestry or DNA in the average Caymanian is probably around 25%, just hazarding a guess based on the DNA matches and what I know of them and how their appearances and so forth.
Right. So, Cathy, you are 71% connected to England, Wales, and Northwestern Europe, and then 20% Ireland and Scotland. And then the third one, which is kind of interesting, is 2% Nigerian.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's kind of interesting. And then it looks like you've got, to a lesser degree, Portugal, maybe some Persian.
But Sandy, from the time I was a child, I remember my mother talking to me about the Bantu tribe in Africa. And if you see on this, I'm 1% Cameroon, Congo, and Southern Bantu. And we did this many years ago. We did I think it was the Geographic project by National Geographic, and my cousin Cathy Briggs did a lot of it, and it traced us right back to the Bantu tribe.
Yeah.
Interesting.
One thing I would want to remark on there with Cathy's DNA profile is that we come from much of the same places, just in very different proportions.
Yes.
So you will find on mine England, Wales, Northwest Europe. You'll find Ireland, Scotland. You'll find Nigeria. You'll find Cameroon, Congo, Southern Bantu, but in just very different percentages from there are in Cathy's.
Yeah. Now, you and Cathy are actually related. So tell us how you discovered that the two of you related and what the actual relation is.
You go, Olivaire.
Right. So we go back to the earliest Watler of whom we can find records with Stephen. And Stephen had 5 children. He had 3 boys and 2 girls. So, and these are very English names, So you've got James and John and Stephen Thomas, and then you've got girls Elizabeth and Mary. I'm descended from James and John, actually. John through my mother and James through my father. Cathy is descended from Stephen Thomas, their brother. She's also descended from their sister, Mary. So you see, we're talking about the double cousins and so forth. And then, of course, I also have Bodden ancestry. And just to make a point here as well, is that every Caymanian Watler is also a bloodline Bodden.
Mhm.
And of course, Cathy's ancestry, I mean, her maiden name is Bodden as well. So Stephen Watler, his wife was Sarah Bodden, right? Um, my fourth great grandfather, James Watler, his wife was Rachel Partridge Bodden. His son, William James Watler, his wife was Lavinia Eleanne Bodden. You got three generations of Watler Bodden.
Mhm. That's right.
So when you got that kind of, DNA being recycled, that explains why the DNA relationships today would be as close as they are. So on paper, I think it might be fifth cousin or something like this, but by DNA, then it's closer than that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Olivaire, do you have rivers in your tree as well?
Well, not that I know of. This is a point that we should make as well.
Because
Most
I
of
have lots of rivers in my tree, and I see there's a Louis Rivers that is watching and maybe, and yeah.
the point we should make there is that there are a lot of unknowns in the family trees on
Right.
male lines. So we will often know the male ancestor, and we'll know the first name of his wife, but we don't necessarily know what her maiden name was, and we don't therefore know what that line is. So that may be a source of many DNA matches that we can't figure out.
Yeah. Well, I know I came from two different rivers, paternal and maternal,
Yeah.
which I thought was rather interesting.
Interesting. Okay, Olivier, you have shared some documents with us as well. So I'm going to just bring those up. Let me just see how to do that. Let me see here. Right. Okay, so you've got an entire PowerPoint presentation. Oliver is very organized with what he's been doing here about the Watlers. And, the first time I saw Cathy and Olivier together was a number of years ago. I can't remember how long, probably maybe 4, 5 years ago.
More than that.
More than that. Wow.
Yeah, it's probably about
They,
8 to 7 years ago now, I think.
yeah, they did a presentation at the National Archives
Yes.
or the National Trust.
And we also did one at the town hall.
Yes, that's more recent. But the one at the National Archives.
This was before. This was yeah, and I found it so interesting, and I think for Olivier, even going back to the two original, I think it was two original Watler brothers that came to the Cayman Islands. So Olivier, let's kind of go through some of what you've given us here, so that we can explain to people exactly what this is. So let me just see.
Okay.
So what is it on this screen that we are currently looking at?
Okay. Now, there has been this story which has been passed down, is reflected in Hearst's notes in the history of the Cayman Islands, that Watler is not a real name. It's a maiden Cayman name. That they crossed the wrong letter. It was Walters, and it became Watler when they came to Cayman, and that's how we got that. And part of the reasoning that you see in Hearst is that the name Watler is unknown in the UK. And so we know that there are Walters who are Welsh, and so the Watlers must have been Welsh. Well, I've exploded that myth.
Okay.
Number one, there were Watlers in the UK. I'm in communication with Watlers in the UK who come from Kent, England. We have tested their DNA, however, and they're not a match. They're a match only at a very, very high level, belonging to the same haplogroup, but not a match in terms of genealogical history to say, well, 300-400 years ago, we had the same common ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, what this is showing is the link. And I believe this is probably the ancestor of the Cayman Watlers. You'll see that Robert Watler, he boarded a ship called the William and John in London on the 2nd of September, 1635,
Mm-hmm.
headed to St. Christopher, which we know as St. Kitts, right? And what's interesting, he was age 20 at the time, and that's what that is showing, Robert Watler, 20. Now, what's interesting there is that this was 20 years before the English invasion of Jamaica, right, under Oliver Cromwell. And we know that in that invasion, Cromwell's army and navy recruited from settlers in the English Eastern Caribbean colonies, among which would have been St. Kitts, Barbados,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps Antigua. So St. Kitts and Nevis.
Wow.
And then also, following the invasion, they encouraged settlers to come from those English colonies in the Eastern Caribbean to settle the newly conquered territory of Jamaica. We see a William Bowden coming from Nevis with a Governor Stokes to settle in Jamaica. We believe that he may be the ancestor of the Cayman Bawdens. We see a Bawden who was what we would say an MLA. He was a legislative Jamaican Assembly in early 1660s. And it may be a connection there with Cayman. We have the oral tradition, of course, that the original settlers were surnamed Bawden and Watler, and they came to Cayman as soldiers from Cromwell's disbanded army and so forth. It might have been that they were soldiers in the army, or it might have been that they were settlers after. But what we do know is that the conditions in Jamaica following that invasion were very inhospitable. For a couple of reasons. One, of course, it had been conquered from the Spanish, and when the Spanish were leaving, they were going to make life difficult for them. So they were burning their crops, they're driving the cattle up into the hills, so that they would have nothing to sustain them. There's stories of, the soldiers there eating dogs so that they could survive. Then also, the health conditions were not great. You had a settlement, from people from the Eastern Caribbean come, and they settled near some swamp, and most of them died. Some 2,000 settlers came, and reportedly only about 200 of them survived. I believe that Cayman was settled because those conditions in Jamaica were so inhospitable at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I think they came to Cayman to fish turtle because there was much food there in Jamaica at that time. And I think they first of all made temporary settlements and then fully settled here. But I think that it was either Robert or maybe a son that was part of that settlement in Jamaica. Robert would have been age 40 at that time. So it's quite reasonable that he could have been a part of that, either as a settler or as a soldier. Or he could have had a 20 or an 18-year-old son who was there.
Wow, interesting. Okay. Yes, it's fascinating. And what's also fascinating, Olivaire, is the fact that you kind of start to delve into general history when you're looking for these connections to kind of explain what may have happened and how this all came about. So just like you said, there are people who are saying, hey, there are really no Watlers, in the UK. And then you had to say, well, yes, there are, but here's what may have transpired to led to the original Watlers settling in the Cayman Islands.
Yeah.
Okay, this next slide, we have an unknown Watler who was born around 1710. Would that have been born in the Cayman Islands?
We don't know.
Okay.
And I'm only kind of speculating that based on the approximate ages of the children.
Right.
So we've got 3 children there, Stephen, Wade, and Elizabeth.
Mhm.
All Cayman Watlers descend from either Stephen or Wade. Elizabeth married a Bodden, and so her descendants would have been Boddens.
Okay, so that's why then you say that all Watlers and Boddens are connected.
Well, not quite. All Watlers are bloodline Boddens, but of course, Bodden was a huge family, so they would have married into other families as well. For example,
Right.
Tatum's one of the early families.
Mhm.
Watlers were always a smaller family. For some reason, were not as prolific as the Boddens.
That's interesting. Okay. All right. So we have Stephen and Wade Watler, and then Elizabeth, who became a Bodden.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
And what are we looking at here in this?
So these are the children of Stephen, and you notice that his wife is Sarah Bodden. And don't be put off by the spelling of the name Bodden there. It's the same family. It's just the spelling was phonetic in those days.
Mhm.
And the same person's name could be spelled a different way depending on who was writing it. Depends on the document it was on. So Sarah Bodden would be part of the same Bodden family. But you see the 5 children that I talked about earlier there.
Mhm.
You'll see the 2 little yellow arrows.
Yes.
They're yellow because those are my 2 ancestors.
Okay. So James Watler Sr. and then John Watler Sr.
Yes.
Okay.
So just to clue you in there, John Watler, a lot of his descendants are in Bodden Town. Some of them came to Gun Bay and then migrated back to Bodden Town. So Mr. Harding Watler, for example, is a descendant of John Watler.
And so then the Watlers kind of originated from Bodden Town, and then
Yeah.
they moved to East End. Is that right? Or
Yeah.
other places? They kind of dispersed.
Right. And I want to make a distinction here. I know it sounds funny, but the East End Watlers, you've got East End proper, and then you've got Gun Bay.
Mm-hmm.
East End proper had a family of Watlers, which is a slightly different branch from the Gun Bay Watlers. Same family, but it's a different branch. The East End Watlers, and I think Cathy may have touched on this earlier when I joined. I believe she was touching on some of this. Descended, from William Stephen Watler Sr. So it appears as if he must have had a first marriage and had William Jacob Watler, the progenitor of the East End Watlers, in that first marriage. The reason I believe so is William Stephen Watler was born about 1816. William Jacob Watler is born about 1836. So he would have been the right sort of age, for a first marriage. And then his first child, who is Cathy's ancestor by the wife that we know about, wasn't born until 1846. That suggests to me that there was a prior marriage, because it would be very unusual in those days to get married for the first time at age 30.
Mhm.
Interesting. Okay.
So that he's a different branch for that reason. My Gun Bay Watlers, and I'm connected to those Watlers as well. I'll explain in a minute. But my Gun Bay Watlers are descended from James, and he had a son called William James Watler, and then my great grandfather is William Eden Watler, Nigel Tiedemann Watler, and then down to my grandmother, actually, to my dad and to me. Now, my grandmother, who was a Watler, also married a Watler, right? So she was a double Watler, Watler by blood, Watler by marriage. And his name was Selbine Watler. Now, he's descended from that same William Jacob Watler. That was his grandfather.
Mhm.
And so I have a connection, even though that's not a blood connection there, we have a connection to that branch as well.
Okay. Wow. All right. So this is a very interesting little chart here. So this is what we think of when we think of typical family trees and kind of how they're laid out and what they look like. So we see again, potentially we've got William S. Watler Jr., Evangeline Thompson, I guess that was his wife.
Mhm.
Yes.
That's the picture that I sent you of the 2 older people.
Yes.
Yeah, that's them.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you see that's the line of descent. Following that arrow,
Mhm.
Stephen Thomas, John B, and I suspect that B stands for Bodden. William S is William Stephen Watler. So you got a William Stephen Watler Sr. and then a William Stephen Watler Jr.
Mhm. Okay.
So the William Jacob we spoke of earlier, he would have been the first son of William Stephen Watler Sr.
Right. And it was William Jacob Watler and my great grandfather, William Stephen Watler. They would have been half brothers, and it was those two that blazed the Mastic Trail. And if you all haven't been on the Mastic Trail, please do it. It is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And all they had was a machete. It's just amazing.
Yes. All right. So we see some Edens thrown into the mix here. Susanna Eden. And lots of, again, Boddens. This name here, John Jeanette.
John Jennett.
From Mary. So how did Mary become, so her mom would have been Mary Ann Bodden.
No, the other way around.
Would have been her daughter. Her mother was
daughter.
Thompson.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Yeah.
So Mary Elizabeth Jeanette is the daughter of?
No. Her daughter is Mary Ann Bodden.
Oh, her daughter is Mary Ann Bodden.
Yeah, it's going from left to right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Got it. Yes. And if I looked at the years, that would make sense. Okay. Huh. Interesting. And then this name Jeanette, that's not a name that I often hear in the Cayman Islands. Has that name continued on, or what has happened? Like, how do names kind of disappear? Like, you see some names that are, obviously still very much in play, and then other names have kind of died out. Did people over time change names? I've heard of people doing that. So, they, I don't know, thought, there's one, I think, with the e-Bankses in West Bay becoming the Banks. I think that might have been a conscious decision to actually change the name from e-Banks to Banks or something, I've heard. Have you heard of any situations like that explain some variations in the names, Olivaire?
Yeah, well, then just touching on Jeanette, first of all, there used to be a Jeanette Street and a Jeanette Building, but those have now changed names. I think Jeanette Street is now Dr. Roy's Drive, isn't it, Cathy?
That's correct.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I think in many cases it was because they had daughters, and those daughters married into other family names, and so you have the bloodline, but not necessarily the surname. A lot of old Romanian names who we don't see represented in the phone book today, but they are deep-rooted Caymanian names.
Yeah. Like the Pages on my mother's side, there were the Pages.
Right.
And that's where we get Pages Bay from, right in front of where the Hard Rock Cafe is now. That was called Pages. That is called Pages Bay, and it was because of the Pages that owned the property back in the very early 1800s, and they had daughters. Now they had, I believe it was one or two sons. Now one of the sons is who I descend from, and that's why my great grandmother on my mother's side was Mary Ann Catherine Page, but she died very, very early. She died when she was, I believe, 30 or 31 years old. And her siblings were all girls except for one boy, and he migrated to somewhere in Central America. I believe it was Honduras, to the Bay Islands. So there are still some Pages, the mainline Page in Honduras, possibly, but there are a lot of the female bloodlines.
Yes.
Has anyone done any significant research? We were talking about this last week about the connection between the Cayman Islands and Honduras, and specifically the Bay Islands. Have we really dug deep and, having a look at who's there that definitely has Cayman connections.
There's a tremendous connection between Cayman and the Bay Islands of Honduras, and that goes back to early days. It goes back to even the very just at the turn of from the 1700s to the 1800s. I believe when they were doing the census in 1802, that Governor William Barton wasn't actually on the island, if I recall correctly. He was visiting his son in the Bay Islands. Later on, after emancipation, there was a mass migration from Cayman to the Bay Islands. So Bay Islands were primarily populated by Caymanians, and that included those of European descent and also, those of African descent. Many of the surnames there are the same. Many of my DNA matches come from the Bay Islands of Honduras. From what I've heard, Bay Islanders, when they speak English, they sound very much like us.
Yes. And I discovered that I think there's a very specific area of the Bay Islands in particular. But I was sharing this story since last week about when I initially returned to the Cayman Islands, and I came back in, I think it was 97. There was a hurricane shortly after that. People reminded me there was actually Hurricane Mitch that hit the Bay Islands and Honduras particularly hard. And so we got interview footage that I saw on the local TV, interviewing people in the Bay Islands. There was just really one specific area. I can't remember the name of it now. But when I heard those people speaking, I had to do like a double take because I'm like, wait a minute, those people sound just like Caymanians, like they sound like us. Yes. And I was very, very surprised because I've always said, that I think the Caymanian accent is one of the most unique in the world. Even when I was in university in Florida, there's a couple instances where I'd hear someone speaking and I turn around and go, "You're from the Cayman Islands?" And they would say, "How do you know that?" And I'm thinking, this accent is so unique. I mean, Caymanians don't know how unique it is. But when I heard them speaking, if I closed my eyes, I would not have known that we were outside of the Cayman Islands.
It's true.
Yeah, after Hurricane Mitch, my husband went down with a group and they rebuilt several homes. And when he was down there, he said, and he came back, he said, "Wow, you have a lot of cousins in the Bay Islands." And I said, "Yeah, I know." He said, and I met several of them.
Wow.
And I haven't met them yet, but he met them. But they know of the connection.
Yes. Interesting. Let's just have a look then. Olivaire, you spent a lot of time putting together these family trees to kind of show precisely how people are connected. Anything of interest on this particular slide? I think this is a continuation, but this one's Charles Watler.
Right. That's continuing that same family line. You'll see going again from left to right.
Okay.
You'll see, William Stephen Watler Sr., William Stephen Watler Jr., and that's Lanneman Watler, and on to Charles Watler. And so I did this because I was establishing what the family tree connections were before doing the DNA. So I wanted to get candidates to show the Watler connection between all the various branches of Cayman Watlers. And so Mr. Charlie then was the representative from that line. But I had to establish what the line is to show how we're related according to the family tree, and then to see if that is supported by the DNA.
Right.
Lanneman Watler was my grandmother's brother.
Right. Okay. And we see the name William Eden on here, which we may be, is that the William Eden? That we have to think of in relation to Pedro's.
So he would have come to Cayman in the 1760s, thereabouts. And he had a prior wife, but he also then married Dorothy Bodden as well. So he had children by two different wives. And then Marianne Eden was a daughter and you'll see that she was the mother of Lavinia Ellen Bawden, who married my great-great-great-grandfather, William James Watler.
Okay, very interesting. So a couple of times you talked about the family tree and then the DNA connections being a little bit different. Can you explain to us how that works? So you've got a family tree here that shows, so and so, these parents had these kids, but the DNA connections can be different. And what causes that?
Right. Well, if we go back to that slide with William Stephen Watler.
Oh, did I pass it? Let's just see. Is it this one?
Yeah. I want to point out something. No, not that one. I need one before that one.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Now, if you look to the far left of that slide, you're going to notice something. You're going to see a number of Bawdens, right, as well as the Watlers. So Stephen Watler married Sarah Bawden. William Eaton married Dorothy Bawden. Governor William Bawden, had a wife, and that's another Bawden. And then Stephen Watler again, of course, that's the same couple. So this is another sibling. So this is Cathy's line, right? So what we're seeing right there is Stephen Thomas and Mary are siblings. So and from those two siblings. And now I am descended from two other siblings, right? James and John. Then also we see Governor William Bawden. I'm descended from Rachel Partridge Bawden, who was a daughter of Governor William Bawden. She's the wife of my fourth great-grandfather, James Watler. So she's my fourth great-grandmother. So right there, without even getting into Sarah Bawden, we've got multiple connections. And that would explain why the DNA then is brought closer than just looking at one line and saying, oh, well, based on this, she's my fifth cousin. But she might be my fifth cousin, 5 or 6 times.
Wow. Okay.
What did you say the Bawden was? Parchment Bawden? Which one was that? Because I have her in my tree too.
Rachel Partridge Bawden.
Rachel Partridge.
Here it is, right here with James Watler Sr.
Yeah, I'm gonna look her up.
Yeah. So I don't know, where she got the partridge from. So that might be another family name connection. But yes, she was the mother of my great-great-great-grandfather, William James Watler. Now, right there, I want to point out that William James Watler, I pointed out his wife was Lavinia Ellen Bawden, but she was not my great-great-great-grandmother. My great-great-great-grandfather, William Eaton Watler, that you see right in the middle of the screen there, his mother was a Black woman. And so we only know her as Jenny Doctor. I represent like that. It could have been just Jenny Doctor, as somebody who, had bush medicine. I'm not sure. But that is where my line of Watlers became mixed at that point. Right below them, you will see John P. McLaughlin. That's John Patrick McLaughlin. And you'll notice his wife was Marianne Lisbon Welcome. You remember I talked about James Welcome earlier? You'll see her father there, James Welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another interracial couple. John Patrick McLaughlin was a white man, and Marianne Lisbon Welcome was a Black woman.
Interesting. Wow. I mean, it is quite fascinating, actually. So you spent a lot of time, I would say, putting this together and trying to make these connections. I see you've even got photos of some people. So here is Ursulina.
Yes.
McLaughlin,
Yes.
1874 to 1964.
Yes.
And then Royal Douglas Watler
Right.
would have been her son.
So that's, the Royal Watler Cruise Terminal. That's who
Yes.
that's named after.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Wow. Amazing. Okay.
Brainerd Watler is her son.
Yes. Okay.
He lives on South Church Street.
Yes.
Wow. Very interesting. Okay. Anything else of interest in this slide, Olivaire, that we might want to take a look at? You were talking about the difference between, and I often hear East Enders say this, and I think if you're not from East End, you probably don't really get it, but they do seem to separate Gun Bay from East End proper.
Yeah.
What's the difference for those of us who are not from East End and we think, oh, it's all East End?
Right. Well, of course, nowadays it's all part of the same district.
Yes.
Same constituency. There's an MLA for all of it. But Gun Bay is actually an older settlement in a way. I mean, you had Old Isaacs in the East End, but that was abandoned after a while. We had Isaac Bodden, Old Isaacs and so forth. But that was abandoned and they basically moved to Bodden Town. But Gun Bay has been the longest continuous settlement. So Gun Bay was actually an official port of entry back in the 1800s. It had a bigger population originally than East End. And so my great granduncle, William Conwell Watler, was, the official government man on that end of the island. He did everything. He was the person who was going to clear entrance to the ships. He was a registrar, the receiver of wrecks, you name it. And so the first congregation that the Presbyterian Church had would have been in Gun Bay. The old church that you see there, which was built in 1907, is actually the second one that was built. The first one, which was even further on the beach, got swept away in a hurricane. And that one was built in 1907. I always remember that because that was the same year that Phoebe was born. And so that's, still standing. There's been refurbishments and, some modernization done to it. But the basic structure is there with wool and daub and, mahogany and so forth.
And then there's a lighthouse too.
Right. Now, the original lighthouse is where you see the wreck of the Ten Sails Park. That was where the original lighthouse was before it was moved to Gorland Bluff, where it is now. Now, I grew up in the house right next door. I mean, immediately next door to the wreck of Ten Sails Park. Now, all of Gun Bay was originally Watler land. Because my fourth great grandfather, James Watler, trailed that land. So from what we call the castle, and I don't know if you where I mean next to the police station, going, that would be north at that point, going up towards Sandy Bluff. On both sides of the road, all of that was owned by Watlers originally. Anyone else who owns it now got it either directly or indirectly from Watlers. Wow. So Gun Bay was more a Watler settlement, than East End.
Wow. This is so fascinating. I'm glad that people are enjoying this. Xavier Ackerman said this is so interesting. Catherine said that my mother went down to Honduras after Mitch, where she met an older sister, but did not identify herself as the lady was white and did not think she would have liked having a dark sister. So very, very interesting. So we have some recommendations. We're pretty much out of time this morning, but this is a conversation that we could certainly carry on for quite some time. in your slide, you talk about the different available Olivaire DNA testing services. And you make mention here that there's only one commercial service that offers testing for the Y DNA. Tell us why that might be preferred to the other services.
Well, I mean, it's one-stop shopping.
Mhm.
That's family tree DNA, and you can get your autosomal DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and different types of Y DNA testing there, up to the highest levels. It's now called the Big Y 700.
Mhm.
That's when you're getting really deep into your ancestry. So we've actually had that tested for the Watlers, and we've done even more advanced testing on that, which shows connections to people who they don't bear the same surname, but the connections probably go back to the days before surnames. Surnames are not that old, by the way. Surnames are about 500-600 years old.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And what happens as well, and I suspect this is the case with the Watlers we found from Kent, England, is that often surnames were based on the occupation of the person. So Watler has a name. I mean, as we know with wattle and dog, so the person who did the wattle is a Watler.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so, of course, more than one person may have that occupation, and more than one person may take up a name based on that occupation. So you could have people with the same surname who are not necessarily blood related.
Interesting. Yes. Wow.
Um,
Let's
it's
get a little more technical.
I mean, I should say just the advantage of ancestry DNA is that it has a much larger database, right? So many more people that you're going to compare your DNA to, going with ancestry than with family tree DNA. But ancestry does not do Y DNA tests.
Okay. Very interesting. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I mean, there's so much information here, and people want to make connections with the Cayman Connection group. Olivier, I understand that that's a website. Are you an administrator or one of the sort of key persons that are involved
Yes, I'm an administrator.
that website? So people can just reach out to you via the website then.
If you want to go back to that screen, we just move. They just make a brief comment on that. What that shows are the clusters of populations that have the same haplogroup, the same specific haplogroup that the Watlers belong to. So we see two dots there. There's a small dot in southwest Germany, and there's a much larger dot in Scotland around Edinburgh. What that suggests to me is that there was probably a migration from Germany, southwest Germany, to Edinburgh, Scotland, and that our Watlers may have come from around that area, Edinburgh, Scotland, to Cayman. Now that actually matches the family tradition that the Watlers originated in Scotland. That's what I've always been told. I believe, Cathy, is it the same tradition on your side?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And if you look at the DNA, you'll see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, I think at some point we will have to have you guys back on the show.
Remember, the Bardens also supposedly came from Germany too.
That's true. It's very interesting because you've got Bodens in Germany and you've got Watlers in Germany, and they lived not that far from each other in Germany. Now, it's interesting that you would get the same two surnames coming from the UK to Cayman.
Yeah.
But I believe they have a Germanic origin.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. All right. Well, there you have it. All Cayman Watlers descend from a common ancestor who lived about 300 plus years ago. Maybe that's a good point to kind of to stop there. We have Rose who wants to get some information on the Webb family. She wants to know a little bit more about her lineage. So yeah, get in contact with Cayman Connections, Rose. Do you guys have a Facebook group as well? Or is it just the website?
It's just a website. I mean, we have individuals who are on Facebook. There is a Cayman Genealogy group on Facebook, but that's a different group.
Right.
It's very it's a lot smaller than that, but still significant.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, very good. All right, well, thank you, Olivaire. Thank you, Cathy, for joining us this morning to dig a little bit deeper and who you for a segment that we're doing this week. Just kind of looking at how we're connected. Again, Olivaire and Cathy are actually cousins. Catherine Smalden has indicated that she has a connection to Cathy as well. She has done her DNA.
I know who that's from.
Yes. So we have Sylvia Welcome, who says that she's got some connections with the Watlers.
Yes.
Her father was Thomas Welcome Watler. And then they have connections to Corn Island, Nicaragua as well.
I want to talk to her. Sylvia, please reach out to me. About the boys and the Watlers down there.
Yes, and I think I have them on my family tree, but just like to confirm some information. She will be descended from Gun Bay Watlers as well.
Okay. All right.
And of course, there's a double connection there with the Welcomes because I'm also descended from James Welcome.
Wow. So Carla Manderson says that she finds this discussion very interesting and informative. And George says there is a Bodden sugar estate in Jamaica, which was large as quarters the parish of St. Anne. So we also have Molly Ann Bodden, who's actually watching from Finland. And she says this is so interesting. And George says that Watlers is also a large family name in Jamaica also.
But I think he's saying Walters.
Oh, sorry, Walters. My apologies. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I'd be happy to do the DNA testing. But based on what I've seen so far, we have actually compared DNA tests with the Welsh Walters, and it wasn't at all the same. It's a completely different haplogroup. So that was even more distant than the kid Watler.
Okay. Anne says that she's also related to you, Cathy. Anne Briggs.
Yes. Her grandmother and my mother were first cousins.
Very good. And Donovan and a few other persons really enjoyed that story that you shared, Olivaire, about James Welcome.
Yeah, I think that he's somebody who should be celebrated.
I agree.
A remarkable individual. I mean, I don't know anywhere else because usually in those days, people were, if you were a slave, you didn't own anything. Whatever you made would belong to your master. So it actually says something not only about him, but also about the slave masters that he would have had, because they would have said, well, you must have had this skill, whatever it was, that you can earn, and we'll allow you to earn. They could have said, whatever money you have, you can't buy your freedom with this because it belongs to us anyway, right? Yeah. And making a point also, we never seem to have had any laws against interracial marriages in Cayman, unlike, for example, in the US. We, from the earliest days that I'm seeing, you were having people of different races getting married. I have at least 5 pairs of great-great-grandparents who are interracial couples, black and white. And those were from, the 1830s onwards. So that wasn't a big issue. I think you couldn't marry a slave. So we have a couple of instances where a person, they were in love, I guess, with a person who was a slave, and they had them freed from slavery and then married them.
And then got married,
Yeah. So, it's a different history. It's a bit,
Yes.
I think that's why Caymanians might find it so difficult to comprehend, a lot of what's going on in the US. Uh,
Mhm.
To
it's
me,
not that there were no racial issues, but I think that they were relatively small in comparison. One of the things I found in looking at old documents is that it was a close relationship often between former slaves or the descendants of former slaves and their
Mhm.
former masters or descendants of their former masters. So you had them witnessing documents for them, acting as executor of their will, um, you know, being a witness at their wedding. All of these, what I found in my research. And so they were kind of living side by side and had their own little plantation ground, and usually they would take care of it, and so there would be a kind of sharecropping going on.
Mhm.
You can farm part of my land, and you give me part of the produce from this land, and so
Mhm.
forth. So our history is a little different, and as I say, I'm not removing the fact that there was racism or discrimination at some level. I mean, we can go back to the story of Long Celia and what happened to her and so forth. Um, but compared to large plantation societies, I don't think there's much comparison.
yeah,
Mhm.
right.
Joan Watler
One of
wants.
my dearest friends, we were talking about some years ago. We were talking about the racial problem in the United States, and she told me, she said, I mean, we've known each other since we were little children, and
Mhm.
I think we are related as well. But she said to me, she said, Kathy, I didn't know I was black until I went to school in the States.
Well, they will certainly make it known there if you had any
That
doubt.
is so sad. It breaks my heart.
Yeah, for sure. Joan Watler says Walter.
Mhm.
Sorry, it's very easy to get those two letters flipped.
Yes.
Want to know if you do a DNA with FTDNA.
Yes, family tree DNA. I have. And I've got a whole bunch of other people who have as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the idea, I think, is the more people that go out there and get DNA tests, the more connections you can make. You know, the more information you have, and perhaps the more gaps that you're able to fill. I've always said that I definitely want to do one. Um, it's kind of one of those things where I just need to arrange, I guess, how to get it shipped to me and then shipping it back, basically.
It's easy.
Yeah.
Olivaire can help you with that.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to know more. And I think Cathy brought up that recently someone was perhaps giving a little bit of information about my history, which I'm very, very interested in. So, Cathy, we can have an off air discussion about that so I can find out who I'm related to. Because I'm actually one of those Caymanians that doesn't really have much of a clue. because,
I'm sure Olivier will remember that email that came out on Cayman Connections, and we were trying to figure out who this person was. And then I don't remember who it was that gave all of the Sandra's history, but it said that she was the descendant of the person that was found on Find a Grave, I believe.
Okay.
I'll look back at the email.
yeah, okay. Well, wow, that's interesting. Now I'm super curious. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I didn't grow up here. I didn't get even Olivier talking about the oral history. I never got to hear any of these stories. So pretty much I know grandparents. On one, I know grandparents for both, but beyond that, I don't honestly have a clue. So I think maybe I'll start digging as well. Andrea says the issues of slavery were different here, even compared to Jamaica. And my grandfather reminded us of that difference, and apparently that was part of the tension. And then Ingrid says, that's so true, Cathy. I didn't know I was Black until I moved to Canada as a child.
Yeah, I've known Ingrid from the time we were children.
Right.
Yeah.
Sandra Ebanks enjoyed the discussion today. She said it was very informative. And thanks to everyone. So, a big thank you to both Olivier and Cathy, who went out of their way this morning to join us on this special segment. Just something this week to kind of figure out a little bit more about who we are, where we've come from, what our history is. I think these things are incredibly important. And I could listen to them all day because I think genealogy is amazing. I was actually looking for an article. I'm going to share the link here in the comment section. But way back in 2006, I remember driving and I was listening to NPR, National Public Radio, which I absolutely love to listen to. And there was a man named Ed Gordon. Well, that's the interviewer who was talking with a David Myers. And David at the time was 46 years old. And he grew up more than half of his life thinking that he was actually a white man. And he didn't find out the truth about his identity, which is he's actually biracial, until the mid 80s. And his mother apparently had told him nothing of his Black biological father. And he was a little bit darker complexion, but she explained that away by saying that he had some kind of a skin disease or something. So he lived a large portion of his life with one racial identity, which obviously in the States is a big deal. And so I'm going to share this link because I think this is so interesting in terms of how we identify ourselves, not just in terms of race, but in terms of color, culture, and how that will shape who we are. You know, if you grew up in a world where you believe you are of a particular culture, it shapes, I think, how you act and how you interact with people, and perhaps even to a large extent, the things that you pick up, the foods that you enjoy eating or whatever. So I think it's a super interesting discussion. Joan says that genealogy is actually her favorite subject. And Donovan says, thanks, Olivaire. Donovan Connor says, thanks, Olivaire, for your deep history. And there's so many names that when I look at, I think, oh, where is this person from? Like, what's the connection? So the Connors are obviously a big name in East End. We know a lot of Connors who are there as well. So perhaps we'll have you guys on again.
It's been my pleasure.
Me too.
Yeah.
For sure.
Thank you for asking
All
that.
right, everyone, let's give a big warm thanks again to Miss Cathy Frazer and Olivaire Watler and Susan Parsons said, great discussion, amazing discussion, and she really enjoyed it. So we know for sure that Cathy did not end up marrying her cousin. We know for sure.
He came here from Texas. I had to make sure he wasn't related to anybody, any Caymanian in Texas.
Yeah, because I was going to say Texas is another kind of hub because of the shipping and stuff, the boats that you put in there. So, and Oliver, I think it's fair to say that you didn't marry your cousin either. So your kids are. Okay. Donovan says this was a very educational topic. Thank you and your media house for this topic. You're welcome, Donovan. All right, folks, tune in. Today is Wednesday, so this is actually my day to go out and about and to get a few things done. So by all means, stick to your name day. There's a little bit of confusion because the grocery stores are no longer checking names. So when you go to the grocery store now, you'll no longer see anyone, at the door checking to see what your last name is. However, this is what I've got from Woody, and I just want to make sure that you guys are aware of how it's working. So they're still encouraging you to go out. So government is still stating that you must shop and conduct your business on your letter day. This has not changed, but the grocery stores themselves, including Foster's, Hurley's, and Kirk's, are not providing the function any longer of checking customer IDs. So it's an honor system now, folks. They're expecting you to just go out on your respective days, but nobody's going to check it. So I guess if on a Thursday I needed an emergency thing, I could probably go to the grocery store, but I'm still trying to stick very much to my Monday, Wednesday, Friday. There's a bit of information yesterday that came out about immigration that seems to have confused people. So I just want to touch on that really quickly before we end the show. A couple of things important. First of all, if you've been here during the COVID-19 shutdown, when government shut down everything, you may have a work permit during that time that expired. Government gave you an amnesty. They were not going to go and arrest you and all that stuff, right? However, now that we're kind of moving closer to things getting back to normal internally within our borders, government wants to remind everyone that they need to now sort out their permit issues by June the 30th. So you've got until the end of this month. So this is really, really important if you have an expired work permit. The reason for this is because you've got to remember that there is an advertising requirement that has to be complied with. So now I'm going to put the link here again in case you've missed this, so that you can see, where you need to go to sort out your immigration business. The Jobs Cayman portal, which is the mandatory government portal now that everyone should be using to advertise available positions within their organizations. You've got to advertise and list a job there for some 14 days for any work permit renewal application, as well as a grant, I would assume. So make sure you know the portal address. The website is in this article. I'll just put the link here in the comment section. Make sure you know how to access that information. There is a how-to guide on the Works website. So Works, remember, is the new name for what was previously immigration. The Works component is responsible for the issuing of work permits and that sort of thing, right? So it stands for the Workplace Opportunities and Residency Cayman. Their offices remain closed to the public, but everything can be done online. So you can put in a new work permit application, you can do your renewals, all of those things are available online. And part of their remit is to also give Caymanians an opportunity to be the first qualified Caymanians, to be the first ones to see jobs and to apply for jobs. And that is why they're directing people to the Jobs Cayman portal. So if you're an unemployed Caymanian, you should go and register with this portal as well, so that you can be checking this portal for jobs that you see advertised, and you can in turn apply for those jobs as well. I think we're going to invite someone from the Works department agency so that they can come in and have a word with us and kind of break it down and tell us exactly how all of this works. But the bottom line is you've got until the end of the month to get your situation sorted. The other thing that was mentioned in the press conference yesterday, which I didn't see a press release on, so I am chasing this up a little bit, is that the Premier did say that anyone who had been issued a temporary work permit during that time, which you've obviously lost some time on that temporary, they were going to be giving you, I believe he said 10 weeks, and this is where I need to confirm. So you're going to get time back on that temporary work permit. So that's good. So now that, if you're in the restaurant business, for example, and you had a temporary in March when we shut down, you haven't lost all of that time. Government's going to give you that time back. And government is also, in terms of the Works Department, really pushing to issue any refunds that they have. The governor has, issued a directive that should be done. And so they're working as diligently as possible to make sure that if the Cayman's government or if immigration owes you money, they get you that money in your hands as quickly as possible. So that was another big thing that came out of yesterday's press conference. So we had 5 cases yesterday. I think that we're still trending relatively well. Yeah, I think that's kind of the highlights. Couple flights to Jamaica. Again, you need to contact the Jamaican consulate to, inquire about how to do that. But I do understand the flights fill up very, very quickly. So it's probably best to just make sure that you are already registered with the consulate for any future flights. So don't wait until you hear, oh, there's a definite date for a flight. Go ahead and register. Same thing with the repatriation flights to the UK or the US, which the governor's office is still very much handling the UK airbridge flights. But you want to make sure that you're registered with the respective government agencies, all on the website. So get registered so that they have an idea of how many people are trying to get off island and how many persons are waiting. Okay, folks, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, I'm so glad that you enjoyed the discussion. Big thank you to Ms. Cathy Frazer and Mr. Olivaire Watler, who gave us their time this morning and their knowledge bank to really share. And we're just touching the surface here, folks, I can tell you. To share a snippet of what they have come across in terms of Cayman genealogy and Cayman family connections and histories. Very, very fascinating stuff. I love this topic as well. and we will definitely have them on again sometime in the future. So you guys have a wonderful day. Susan Thompson, Susan Parsons, Andrea, Christian, Jeanne, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Miss June, Donovan, Zivia, Ingrid, Sandra, everyone, thanks for your contributions to the discussion. And you guys have a wonderful and safe day. And we'll see you here tomorrow morning.